Biazer's Whispers of the Desert Wind. Picture, if you will, the moment just before dawn in the western desert of Libya, April 1941. The horizon stretches endlessly in every direction, a canvas of amber and ochre that seems to blur the very boundaries between earth and sky. Here, where the Mediterranean meets the Sahara, stands a small coastal fortress that will soon become synonymous with one of the most remarkable defensive stands in military history. Tobruk. The name itself carries weight now, doesn't it? But in those early months of 1941, to the thousands of Allied soldiers arriving by ship and convoy, Tobruk was simply coordinates on a map. A collection of whitewashed buildings shimmering in the desert heat, surrounded by an ancient Italian perimeter that seemed almost quaint against the vastness of the landscape. The strategic mind immediately grasps why this particular patch of desert mattered so profoundly. Tobruk possessed the only deep-water harbor between Alexandria and Benghazi, a distance of nearly 800 miles of hostile coastline. Control this harbor, and you control the logistics lifeline for any army attempting to advance toward the Suez Canal. Lose it, and you force your supply convoys into a punishing overland journey through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. But strategy, however elegant on paper, must always contend with reality. And the reality facing the Allied forces in April 1941 was sobering indeed. The German Afrika Korps, under the command of a relatively unknown general named Erwin Rommel, had just completed a lightning advance across Cyrenaica that defied every assumption about desert warfare. In just 12 days, this desert fox had recaptured virtually everything the British had won during their winter offensive against the Italians. The soldiers arriving at Tobruk understood this context with the clarity that only comes to men facing mortal danger. They had seen the steady stream of retreating units, the hastily abandoned equipment, the dust clouds on the horizon that might signal either reinforcements or pursuit. These were not naive recruits, but seasoned professionals who could read the tactical situation with uncomfortable precision. Among them were the men of the 9th Australian Division, commanded by Major General Leslie Morshead, a veteran of Gallipoli who possessed that particular combination of tactical brilliance and stubborn determination that the coming siege would demand. Morshead understood something that would prove crucial in the weeks ahead: that modern warfare, for all its mechanized sophistication, still ultimately depended on the willingness of individual soldiers to hold their ground when retreat seemed the only rational option. The fortress itself presented a fascinating study in military engineering across different eras. The Italians had constructed their defensive perimeter using principles that hadn't fundamentally changed since the days of Vauban. A roughly semicircular line of concrete posts and anti-tank ditches that relied on interlocking fields of fire and natural obstacles. But this was 1941, and warfare had evolved in ways that rendered many traditional defensive concepts obsolete. The perimeter stretched for approximately 30 miles around the port, anchored on the Mediterranean at both ends. To an engineer's eye, it possessed certain advantages. The terrain was largely open, offering excellent visibility and clear fields of fire. The rocky ground made digging difficult for attacking forces, while the scattered wadis, those dry riverbeds that scored the landscape, provided natural defensive positions for the defenders. Yet the very size of this perimeter created profound challenges. 30 miles of front line, defended by roughly 30,000 men. The mathematics were uncomfortably clear. This meant approximately 1,000 men per mile, spread across positions that often lay beyond mutual supporting distance. In conventional military doctrine, such a deployment invited defeat in detail, the systematic destruction of isolated strongpoints before reinforcements could arrive. The desert itself became as much an enemy as any human opponent. Veterans of the North African campaign would later speak of the landscape with a mixture of awe and dread that bordered on the mystical. During the day, temperatures soared above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, turning metal equipment into instruments of torture and making any physical exertion a test of endurance. The sun seemed to drain not just moisture, but will itself, creating a lethargy that required constant vigilance to overcome. But it was the wind that truly defined the desert experience, that relentless, abrading force that carried sand into every crevice of equipment and flesh. The Khamsin, as the Arabs called it, could blow for days without pause, reducing visibility to mere yards and infiltrating even the most carefully sealed positions. Soldiers learned to wrap their faces in whatever cloth they could find, creating an army of anonymous, spectral figures moving through an amber twilight. Water became the currency of survival, more precious than ammunition or fuel. Each man's daily ration, measured in careful pints rather than the gallons his body craved, represented a complex logistical calculation that stretched back hundreds of miles to Alexandria. The quartermaster's ledgers became documents of life and death, tracking not just supplies but the very possibility of continued resistance. Yet within this harsh environment, something remarkable began to emerge. The isolation of Tobruk, rather than breeding despair, seemed to foster an almost tribal solidarity among its defenders. Cut off from the normal chain of reinforcement and resupply, the garrison developed the psychological characteristics of a fortress under siege. That peculiar mixture of defiance and dark humor that sustains men when conventional hope seems insufficient. The soldiers began to refer to themselves with sardonic pride as the Rats of Tobruk, a nickname that originated as German propaganda, but was embraced with the perverse satisfaction of men who understood that their situation, however desperate, represented something historically significant. They were not merely holding a position, they were denying Rommel the key to his entire strategic concept. And Rommel himself. Here was an opponent worthy of respect and study. Unlike many German commanders who remained wedded to European concepts of warfare, the Desert Fox had immediately grasped the unique characteristics of North African combat. He understood that in the desert, mobility trumped mass, that the side which could move faster and strike more unexpectedly would prevail regardless of numerical advantage. His tactical innovations were already becoming legendary among both his own forces and his enemies. The aggressive use of anti-tank guns in forward positions, the coordination of armor, artillery, and air support in what would later be called combined arms warfare, the willingness to take calculated risks that more cautious commanders would reject. These were the hallmarks of a military genius adapting classical principles to revolutionary circumstances. But genius, however brilliant, must still contend with logistics. And here, the defenders of Tobruk possessed an advantage that no amount of tactical brilliance could entirely overcome. As long as the Royal Navy controlled the Mediterranean approaches to the harbour, the garrison could be resupplied, albeit at tremendous cost and constant risk. Each convoy that successfully reached Tobruk represented not just material reinforcement, but proof that the siege remained incomplete. The psychological impact of this lifeline cannot be overstated. Soldiers can endure almost any hardship if they believe their sacrifice serves a larger purpose, if they understand that their resistance contributes to eventual victory rather than mere delay. The sight of ships appearing on the horizon, running the gauntlet of German air attacks to deliver supplies and evacuate wounded, provided tangible evidence that Tobruk remained connected to the broader Allied cause. As April progressed into May, the character of the coming siege began to clarify. This would not be a brief, decisive assault, followed by rapid resolution. Instead, it would become a grinding test of endurance, a contest between Rommel's need to capture the port quickly and advance toward Egypt, and the Allies' determination to deny him that prize regardless of cost. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable defensive stands in military history, a siege that would last 241 days and fundamentally alter the strategic balance in North Africa. In the weeks ahead, the Rats of Tobruk would discover reserves of courage and ingenuity they never knew they possessed, while Rommel would learn the limits of even tactical genius when confronted with determined resistance. But that story, that epic of endurance and sacrifice, was still unfolding as the desert wind continued its ancient song across the amber landscape. The men settling into their positions around the perimeter could not yet know that their names would be remembered alongside Thermopylae and Alamo, that their stubborn defense would provide the time necessary for Allied forces to regroup and eventually launch the offensive that would drive the Afrika Korps back across the very ground it had conquered. All they knew in those final moments before the siege began in earnest was that they held a piece of desert that someone else wanted very badly, and that they had been asked to keep it. Entrenchment and shadows. The first shells began falling at dawn on April 11th, their distant thunder rolling across the perimeter like an approaching storm. The men who had spent the night in restless anticipation now found themselves thrust into the reality of siege warfare, a reality that would define every hour of the next 8 months. Lieutenant Colonel John Edmondson crouched in what had been a shipping office 48 hours earlier, now transformed into a forward observation post. Through his field glasses, he watched the dust clouds on the horizon resolve into the familiar shapes of German panzers. Panzer IIIs and IVs advancing in textbook formation across the broken ground south of the fortress. Behind them came the mechanized infantry, their half-tracks creating long plumes of sand that caught the morning light like golden banners. "Range, 2,000 yards and closing," called his artillery spotter, a young sergeant whose voice carried the steady calm that would become the hallmark of Tobruk's defenders. The mathematics of survival had begun. Angles of fire, rates of advance, the careful calculation of when to reveal their positions and when to remain hidden in the rocky ground. The German assault followed Rommel's preferred doctrine: swift, concentrated pressure applied at what appeared to be the weakest point in the Allied line. But Morshead had anticipated this approach. The perimeter defense had been designed not as a rigid wall, but as a series of mutually supporting strongpoints, each capable of independent action, each positioned to provide enfilading fire across the approaches to its neighbors. As the panzers closed to within 800 yards, the first of the carefully concealed anti-tank guns opened fire. The sharp crack of the 2-pounder was followed immediately by the deeper boom of the 25-pounders, their shells bursting among the advancing German infantry with devastating precision. The attack faltered, not from lack of courage, but from the sudden realization that Tobruk would not fall to a single bold stroke. In the hours that followed that first repulse, the true character of the siege began to emerge. This would not be a brief, decisive engagement, but a grinding test of endurance, a contest between German determination to take the port and Allied resolve to deny it to them. Both sides began the methodical work of preparing for a long campaign. The defenders threw themselves into the ancient art of fortification with an energy born of necessity. Every available man not on immediate duty found himself wielding a shovel, digging trenches, constructing bunkers, creating the underground network that would become their second home. The rocky ground of Cyrenaica fought them at every turn. Pickaxes rang against limestone, and progress was measured in inches rather than feet. But gradually the perimeter began to take on the characteristics of a proper fortress. Communication trenches snaked between the strongpoints, allowing movement without exposure to German observation. Command bunkers were carved into the harder rock formations, their entrances camouflaged with salvaged materials and desert scrub. Ammunition dumps were dispersed and buried, each one positioned to survive direct hits while remaining accessible to the gun positions they served. The work continued around the clock, but it was work punctuated by the constant threat of enemy action. German artillery had found the range to most of the perimeter by the second day, and their forward observers had established themselves in positions that commanded excellent views of Allied activity. Every movement during daylight hours invited immediate and accurate fire. The men learned quickly to read the rhythms of the siege. The pre-dawn hours brought relative quiet, a time when both sides tended to their wounded, redistributed supplies, and prepared for the day ahead. As the sun climbed higher, the tempo of artillery fire would increase, ranging shots followed by concentrated bombardments of suspected Allied positions. Midday brought the Stukas, the distinctive gull-winged dive bombers that had become synonymous with German tactical air power. Their approach was always announced by the same sequence of sounds. First the distant drone of engines, then the rising whine of aircraft in steep dives, and finally the earth-shaking detonations of their bombs. The men learned to distinguish between the different types of ordnance by sound alone. The sharp crack of high explosive, the deeper rumble of delayed action bombs, the peculiar whistle of anti-personnel devices. But it was during these air raids that something remarkable began to happen. Instead of breaking under the psychological pressure, the defenders found themselves developing an almost casual familiarity with danger. They learned to judge the approach angles of diving aircraft, to distinguish between attacks aimed at their own positions and those targeting other sections of the perimeter. They developed an informal but effective system of warnings and responses that required no orders from above. "Here they come again" became as routine an announcement as a call to meals. Men would glance up from their work, assess the immediate threat, and take whatever cover was available, often continuing their conversations even as bombs fell around them. This was not bravado, but rather the natural human adaptation to circumstances that initially seemed unendurable. The nickname began appearing in letters home sometime during the third week of the siege. "We're living like rats down here," wrote one soldier to his wife in Adelaide, "but we're rats with teeth." The comparison was apt in ways that perhaps he didn't fully realize. Like rats, they had learned to thrive in an environment that seemed hostile to human habitation. They had created an underground world of tunnels and burrows, a hidden city beneath the official geography of the fortress. The German propaganda machine, always alert to opportunities for psychological warfare, seized upon the comparison. Radio broadcasts from Berlin began referring to the defenders as the rats of Tobruk, trapped vermin who would eventually be smoked from their holes. But the intended insult was received quite differently by its targets. The men of the garrison embraced the label with a pride that surprised even themselves. To be a rat of Tobruk meant something specific. It meant belonging to a brotherhood forged in shared hardship. It meant having survived the daily lottery of shell and bomb, having learned to find humor in circumstances that would have seemed unbearable just weeks before. It meant being part of something larger than individual survival, a collective act of defiance that was already beginning to capture the imagination of the Allied world. The daily routines that emerged during these weeks would persist throughout the entire siege. Before dawn, the sentries would be relieved, tired men stumbling back to their dugouts while fresh eyes took up the watch. Breakfast, when it could be managed, consisted of whatever rations had made it through the previous day's bombardment. Often cold, always monotonous, but consumed with the appreciation of men who understood that the next meal was never guaranteed. The morning hours were devoted to maintenance and improvement of positions. Weapons were cleaned and tested, not from any regulation requirement, but from the intimate knowledge that mechanical failure meant death. Ammunition was counted and redistributed. Radio equipment was checked and rechecked. Communication with other strongpoints being literally a matter of life and death when coordinated fire support was needed. As the heat of the day intensified, activity moved underground. The deeper bunkers provided not only protection from enemy fire, but relief from the crushing temperatures that could reach 120 degrees in the shade, when shade could be found. Men wrote letters, played cards with decks that grew more battered each day, and engaged in the endless conversations that helped maintain morale and sanity. These conversations revealed the remarkable diversity of the garrison. Australians formed the largest contingent, but there were also British gunners, South African engineers, Indian transport troops, and Polish refugees who had made their way to North Africa through a dozen different routes. The shared experience of siege was creating bonds that transcended national and cultural differences, bonds that would endure long after the war ended. The evening brought its own challenges and opportunities. As temperatures dropped and visibility decreased, both sides became more aggressive. German patrols would probe the perimeter, seeking weak points or attempting to capture prisoners for intelligence purposes. Allied counter-patrols would venture into no man's land, sometimes to gather information, sometimes simply to demonstrate that the siege had not broken their offensive spirit. These nocturnal encounters were brief, violent affairs, decided by superior knowledge of local terrain and the split-second reactions of men whose nerves had been honed by weeks of constant danger. They were fought with grenades and bayonets, weapons that made no sound to alert distant artillery observers, but which required a kind of courage that even veteran soldiers found difficult to sustain. Yet sustain it they did, night after night, week after week. The rats of Tobruk were learning that they possessed reserves of endurance they had never suspected. They were discovering that ordinary men, placed in extraordinary circumstances, could accomplish things that would have seemed impossible just months before. In their underground world of tunnels and bunkers, connected by radio and bound by shared purpose, they were writing a chapter in military history that would inspire Allied forces around the world and provide the strategic breathing space that would ultimately turn the tide in North Africa. Hofia, the siege tightens. The morning sun would rise each day over the Mediterranean, casting long shadows across the defensive perimeter. But for the men of Tobruk, time had taken on a different quality altogether. Days blended into weeks, marked not by calendars but by the rhythm of bombardments, the arrival of supply convoys, and the gradual wearing away of everything they had once taken for granted. In the maze of tunnels beneath the fortress, life had settled into patterns that would have seemed surreal to these same men just months earlier. The underground chambers, carved from rock and reinforced with salvaged materials, had become entire neighborhoods. Each unit had claimed its own section, decorating the walls with photographs from home, maps of Australia, and improvised artwork created from whatever materials could be found. The Australian 9th Division had transformed these subterranean spaces into something approaching civilization. Workshop areas where weapons were cleaned and repaired, sleeping quarters where men could escape the relentless heat of the desert sun, communication centers where radio operators maintained the vital links between defensive positions. The air was thick with dust and the smell of cordite, but it was their air in their fortress. Water remained the most precious commodity. Each man's daily ration could fit in a single canteen, and every drop was accounted for. The defenders had learned to shave with cold tea, to wash their clothes in the same water they used for drinking, and to collect the precious condensation that formed on metal surfaces during the cool desert nights. The ingenuity born of necessity had reached remarkable heights. Mechanics had learned to repair vehicles using parts cannibalized from destroyed tanks and trucks. Signalmen had created communication networks using telephone wire salvaged from bombed buildings. Cooks had mastered the art of preparing meals that were both nutritious and palatable using only tinned rations and whatever local ingredients could be safely foraged. But perhaps most impressive was the way the defenders had learned to read the desert itself. They could distinguish between the sound of incoming German artillery and the rumble of their own guns firing in response. They knew which direction the wind was blowing by the way the sand settled in their foxholes. They had memorized the timing of enemy patrol schedules and the blind spots in German observation positions. The psychological toll, however, was becoming increasingly evident. Letters from home took weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. News from the outside world came in fragments, often contradictory, sometimes deliberately optimistic to maintain morale. The men knew that major battles were being fought across North Africa, but their own world had contracted to the 30-mile perimeter they defended with such determination. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and interrupted. The German artillery followed no predictable schedule, and the sound of approaching aircraft could transform peaceful moments into frantic scrambles for cover. Many defenders had developed what would later be recognized as the 1,000-yard stare, that distant look of men who had seen too much and learned to expect the worst while hoping for the best. The medical challenges were mounting as well. Dr. McCallum and his medical staff worked in underground facilities that doubled as bomb shelters, treating everything from battle wounds to the diseases that flourished in the crowded, dusty conditions. Dysentery was becoming endemic. Skin conditions caused by constant exposure to sand and limited washing facilities were affecting nearly everyone. Yet somehow, the medical corps maintained standards of care that seemed impossible under the circumstances. Food had become a subject of endless creativity and constant complaint. The tinned beef that formed the staple of their diet had earned a dozen unflattering nicknames. The hardtack biscuits required soaking in precious water before they could be safely consumed without risking broken teeth. But the cooks had learned to create variations that provided both nutrition and something approaching flavor. Stews that combined tinned meat with wild desert plants, bread baked in improvised ovens constructed from ammunition boxes and heated with carefully hoarded fuel. The mail, when it arrived with supply convoys, provided moments of connection to the world beyond the perimeter. Men would gather in small groups to share news from home, reading passages from letters aloud, discussing the harvests in Australia, the progress of brothers and sons training for military service. These letters were read until they fell apart, then carefully preserved between the pages of Bibles and photograph albums. Meanwhile, beyond the fortress walls, the strategic situation was evolving in ways that would profoundly affect the siege. In May, British forces had launched Operation Brevity, an ambitious attempt to relieve the pressure on Tobruk and push Rommel's forces back toward Tripoli. For the defenders, this had meant days of heightened anticipation, listening to the sound of distant artillery and watching for signs that relief was approaching. But Operation Brevity had failed to achieve its objectives. The attacking British forces, though brave and determined, lacked the coordination and overwhelming strength necessary to break through Rommel's defensive positions. Within days, it became clear that relief would not be coming, at least not yet. The disappointment was palpable throughout the garrison, though the men had learned to mask their feelings behind the dark humor that had become their trademark. June brought Operation Battleaxe, an even more ambitious relief effort. This time, the British forces included significant tank formations and had been reinforced with equipment that had survived the dangerous journey through the Mediterranean. For nearly a week, the sound of major tank battles could be heard in the distance, and the defenders allowed themselves to hope that this time would be different. The failure of Battleaxe was even more crushing than the failure of Brevity. Not only had relief failed to arrive, but the defenders could see the smoke of burning British tanks on the horizon. Evidence that their would-be rescuers had suffered significant losses. The realization that they might be on their own for months longer settled over the garrison like the desert dust that covered everything. Yet somehow this news seemed to strengthen rather than weaken their resolve. If no one was coming to rescue them, then they would rescue themselves through sheer determination and tactical excellence. The defensive positions were further improved. Patrol activities were intensified. The underground network was expanded to include new workshops and storage areas. The nightly supply runs by the Royal Navy had become legendary throughout the Mediterranean. These destroyers and fast cruisers would approach the harbour under cover of darkness, unload their precious cargo of ammunition, medical supplies and mail, then disappear before dawn could expose them to German air attacks. The sailors who made these runs had earned the deep respect of the garrison, men who risked their lives repeatedly to ensure that the fortress could continue its resistance. But supplies remained critically short. Ammunition was rationed carefully, with each defensive position allocated specific quantities based on their tactical importance. Fuel was so precious that vehicles were used only for essential missions. Medical supplies were stretched to cover needs that seemed to grow daily as the siege wore on. The defenders had learned to find entertainment and meaning in the smallest things. Card games played with decks held together by tape and determination. Informal concerts featuring men who had discovered unexpected musical talents. Debates about politics, philosophy, and the future of Australia that could continue for hours in the cool evening air. Some men had taken up writing, journals that recorded not just the military events of each day, but the small human moments that made life bearable. The way morning light looked when it first penetrated the underground chambers. The sound of laughter echoing through the tunnels after someone told a particularly good joke. The sight of wildflowers that somehow managed to bloom in protected corners of the defensive perimeter. As July approached, the defenders of Tobruk had become something unique in military history. They were no longer simply soldiers following orders. They had become the living embodiment of a fortress that refused to surrender. Each man understood that his individual actions contributed to a larger strategic purpose that extended far beyond the boundaries of their desert stronghold. The isolation had forged them into a brotherhood that transcended rank and regional differences. Officers and enlisted men shared the same dangers, ate the same food, and slept in the same underground chambers. The normal barriers of military hierarchy remained in place for operational purposes, but had been supplemented by the deeper bonds of men who had faced death together and chosen to stand firm. In the growing darkness of each evening, as the last light faded from the Mediterranean sky, the defenders would prepare for another night of vigilance. Sentries would take their positions along the perimeter. Radio operators would check in with each defensive sector. Medical personnel would prepare for whatever casualties the night might bring. And in the quiet moments between the sounds of war, they would remember why they were there. Not just to hold a piece of desert real estate, but to prove that free men, properly motivated and skillfully led, could stand against any force that threatened the values they held dear. Jadasam, supply lines and silent nights. The lifeline that sustained Tobruk's defenders stretched across some of the most dangerous waters in the Mediterranean. Every night, as darkness settled over the besieged port, a different kind of courage was being tested on the moonlit sea. The courage of merchant sailors and naval crews who knew that their cargo meant the difference between survival and surrender for the men trapped behind enemy lines. The supply runs to Tobruk were exercises in calculated desperation. Fast destroyers and cruisers, their holds crammed with ammunition, medical supplies, and precious fresh water, would race across the 150 miles of open sea from Alexandria. They moved under cover of darkness. Timing their arrival to unload and depart before dawn exposed them to the Stukas that prowled the coastline like mechanical vultures. Captain James Morrison of the destroyer HMS Defender understood the mathematics of these runs better than most. Each voyage was a race against time, measured not in hours but in the precious minutes between sunset and sunrise. His ship could carry perhaps 60 tons of supplies, enough ammunition for 2 days of heavy fighting, enough water for a week if the garrison was careful. It never seemed like enough. The approach to Tobruk harbor required navigation through waters that had become a graveyard of twisted metal and broken dreams. Italian and German aircraft had sown the approaches with mines, their positions shifting with each tide and storm. The harbor itself bore the scars of months of bombing. Cranes twisted into abstract sculptures of steel, warehouses reduced to skeletal frameworks against the star-filled sky. Morrison's crew had developed their own rituals for these runs. The engine room crew would check every bearing and gasket twice, knowing that a mechanical failure in these waters meant certain death or capture. The gunners would clean their weapons with an almost religious devotion, understanding that German E-boats often lurked in the darkness, waiting to intercept the supply convoys with torpedo and cannon fire. On the night of July 15th, Morrison's destroyer approached Tobruk, carrying a cargo more precious than gold: the components for a new radio transmitter that would allow the garrison to maintain contact with Cairo, and medical supplies that included morphine, sulfur powder, and whole blood for transfusions. The ship also carried something that couldn't be measured in tons or catalogued in manifests: letters from home, photographs of wives and children, and small packages that represented the enduring connections between the besieged garrison and the world they were fighting to preserve. The unloading process had been refined through months of practice into a carefully choreographed dance of efficiency and desperation. Australian dockers, working by the faint light of shielded lanterns, would form human chains to move supplies from ship to shore. Every man understood that speed meant survival, that the longer the ship remained in harbour, the greater the chance that dawn would catch them exposed and vulnerable. Sergeant Bill Mackenzie, a dock foreman from Sydney, who had volunteered to stay behind when the last civilian workers were evacuated, supervised these midnight operations with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. He knew exactly how long it took to unload different types of cargo. Ammunition boxes could be moved quickly by passing them hand to hand, but water containers required more careful handling to prevent precious spillage. Mackenzie had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when German reconnaissance aircraft were approaching. Something in the rhythm of the night sounds, the way the wind carried the distant rumble of artillery, or perhaps just the accumulated wisdom of a man who had learned to read the subtle signs of danger, would alert him to order the immediate dousing of all lights and the temporary halt of all movement. During these moments of enforced stillness, the men would stand frozen in the darkness, listening to the drone of aircraft engines passing overhead. The silence was profound and unsettling, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the harbour wall and the distant percussion of artillery exchanges along the perimeter. These were the moments when the isolation of their situation became most apparent, when each man confronted the reality that they were utterly dependent on the courage of sailors like Morrison and his crew. The return journey was often more dangerous than the approach. German intelligence had learned to anticipate the timing of these supply runs, and E-boats would position themselves along the likely routes back to Alexandria. The fast German patrol craft were formidable opponents, armed with torpedoes and rapid-fire cannons, crewed by veterans who understood the tactical advantages of fighting in familiar waters under cover of darkness. Morrison had survived 3 encounters with E-boats during his months of running supplies to Tobruk. Each engagement had been a deadly game of hide-and-seek played at high speed in the darkness, with survival depending on split-second decisions and the superior training of his crew. The destroyer's advantage lay in its heavier armament and better radar, but the German boats were faster and more maneuverable, able to appear suddenly from behind rocky outcroppings or vanish into the maze of small islands that dotted the coastline. The psychological toll of these runs was enormous. Morrison's crew understood that each voyage might be their last, that a single torpedo or a well-placed shell could send them to the bottom in minutes. Yet they also understood the strategic importance of their mission. Without the supplies they carried, Tobruk would fall within weeks. And if Tobruk fell, the entire Allied position in North Africa might collapse, opening the way for German forces to reach the Suez Canal and the oil fields of the Middle East. Back within the perimeter, the defenders had learned to listen for the sound of approaching ships with an intensity that bordered on desperation. The faint rumble of destroyer engines in the distance was sweeter than any music, a sound that meant ammunition for another week of fighting, medical supplies for the wounded, and perhaps most importantly, proof that they had not been forgotten by the outside world. Private Tommy Richardson, manning an observation post on the harbor's edge, had become expert at identifying different types of ships by their engine signatures. He could distinguish between the high-pitched whine of a fast destroyer and the deeper throb of a slower cruiser. More importantly, he could differentiate between Allied engines and the distinctive sound of German E-boats, a skill that had saved lives on more than one occasion when enemy patrol craft attempted to infiltrate the harbor under cover of darkness. The unloading complete, Morrison's crew would begin their preparations for the dangerous journey home. The ship's cook would distribute hot tea and sandwiches, simple fare that tasted magnificent to men who understood they were about to face several hours of potential combat. The navigator would plot multiple return routes, knowing that flexibility might mean the difference between survival and destruction if they encountered enemy forces. As the destroyer slipped away from Tobruk's battered quays, the silence of the desert night would settle once again over the harbor. But it was a different kind of silence now, pregnant with possibility rather than despair. The successful arrival of supplies meant that the garrison could continue its defiant stand for another week, another month, however long it might take for relief forces to break through the German lines. The men who remained behind would distribute the precious cargo with the careful attention of pharmacists measuring life-saving medicine. Ammunition would be allocated according to carefully calculated formulas based on expected enemy activity. Medical supplies would be inventoried and stored in the deepest, most protected bunkers. Water would be distributed with religious precision, every drop accounted for and cherished. In the quiet hours before dawn, as the last of the supplies disappeared into the underground storage areas that honeycombed the garrison, the defenders would return to their posts with renewed determination. The successful supply run was more than just a delivery of material goods. It was proof that their sacrifice had meaning, that their stand at Tobruk was part of a larger strategy that extended far beyond the desert perimeter they defended with such tenacious courage. The cycle would repeat itself in a few days. Another ship, another crew, another group of sailors willing to risk everything to ensure that the rats of Tobruk could continue their defiant stand against the Afrika Korps. Each successful run strengthened the bonds between the garrison and the outside world, proving that even in the most isolated circumstances, courage and determination could forge connections that no enemy could sever. And in the growing light of another desert dawn, as the last echoes of ship engines faded into the distance, the defenders of Tobruk would prepare for another day of siege, sustained by supplies that had been purchased with courage, delivered by heroes, and distributed with the careful attention that befitted such precious cargo. Whispers of relief, echoes of departure. As the weeks turned to months through the scorching heat of the North African summer, a different kind of change began to stir within the perimeter of Tobruk. The political winds in Australia had shifted, and with them came decisions that would transform the composition of the garrison that had held this vital port for so long. The Australian government, facing mounting pressure from public opinion and strategic concerns about Japanese expansion in the Pacific, had begun to question the wisdom of keeping their forces tied down in what seemed an endless siege. Prime Minister Curtin's cables to Churchill grew more insistent. The 9th Australian Division had been away from home for nearly 2 years, fighting first in the Western Desert, then enduring months of siege warfare under conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. But relief, when it came, would be bittersweet. The first indication came through the usual channels. coded messages that filtered down through the chain of command, speaking of rotations and reinforcements. Yet for the men who had lived through the crucible of those early German assaults, who had carved their homes from the limestone and learned to sleep through the whistle of incoming shells, the prospect of leaving carried complex emotions. They had become something more than soldiers during their time in Tobruk. They had become guardians of a legend, keepers of a flame that had burned bright in the darkest days of 1941. The thought of handing over their positions to others, however capable, stirred feelings they hadn't expected. The replacement troops began arriving on the same destroyers and cruisers that had sustained the garrison for months. First came elements of the 1st Polish Carpathian Brigade, men whose own journey to this desert fortress had been marked by extraordinary hardship and determination. These Polish soldiers carried with them stories that resonated deeply with the Australian defenders. They had fled their homeland as it fell to German invasion, had reformed in France only to see that nation collapse, had made their way through Syria and Palestine to reach this remote corner of North Africa. Their faces bore the same weathered determination that marked all who had endured too much, yet refused to surrender. The initial meetings between the Australians and their Polish replacements unfolded with the careful courtesy of professional soldiers. But beneath the surface lay deeper currents of mutual respect. The Poles studied the defensive positions with the keen attention of men who understood that their lives would soon depend on this knowledge. The Australians, in turn, recognized in these newcomers the same quiet competence that had served them so well. This section here, an Australian corporal would explain, pointing to a particularly well-camouflaged strongpoint. Jerry tried to take it 3 times in April. The key is the interlocking fields of fire. See how we've positioned the Brens to cover each other's blind spots. The Polish lieutenant would nod, his English careful but precise. In our country, we learned similar lessons. The Germans, they are methodical, but sometimes this makes them predictable. Such conversations took place throughout the perimeter as the handover process began. Maps were studied by lamplight in underground bunkers, the locations of minefields carefully marked and explained, the habits of German snipers discussed with the detailed knowledge that came from months of deadly hide-and-seek. But it was in the quiet moments, during the brief respites between official duties, that deeper connections formed. Australian soldiers shared their carefully hoarded supplies of tea. Poles offered cigarettes that carried the faint aroma of distant tobacco fields. Stories were exchanged, tales of home that seemed to belong to another world, another lifetime. The British troops who accompanied the Polish brigade brought their own character to this changing garrison. Many were veterans of other desert campaigns, men who had fought in the early disasters and learned hard lessons about warfare in North Africa. They understood the rhythm of siege life, the importance of water discipline, the art of making a little go a long way. Yet for all their experience, these newcomers looked upon the Australian defenders with something approaching awe. The reputation of the Rats of Tobruk had spread throughout the 8th Army. Stories of their successful defense had become legend in the camps and cantonments from Cairo to Benghazi. 8 months, a British sergeant would murmur, shaking his head as he surveyed the elaborate defensive network. 8 months of this, and you never gave them an inch. The Australian response was typically understated. Well, mate, it's not like we had anywhere else to go. But beneath such casual words lay a profound truth. These men had been transformed by their experience, forged into something harder and more resilient than they had ever imagined possible. The siege had stripped away everything non-essential, leaving behind only what mattered most: courage, loyalty, the unbreakable bonds between men who had faced the worst together and refused to break. As the handover continued, a complex dance of departure and arrival unfolded throughout the fortress. Australian units would brief their replacements during the day, then spend their final nights in positions they had held for months, listening to the familiar sounds of the siege, the distant rumble of German generators, the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle, the whispered conversations of sentries changing guard. Some of the departing soldiers found themselves reluctant to leave posts that had become as familiar as home. This sangar, laboriously carved from solid rock, that observation post, perfectly positioned to watch the German lines. These places held memories that would last a lifetime. The Polish and British troops, meanwhile, settled into the rhythm of siege warfare with the adaptability of experienced soldiers. They learned to recognize the different sounds of incoming artillery, to distinguish between the whine of a German 88 and the heavier crash of howitzer shells. They discovered the subtle art of moving through the fortress without attracting sniper fire, the importance of never following the same route twice. But perhaps most importantly, they absorbed something of the spirit that had sustained the original garrison. The determination that had earned the title Rats of Tobruk was not merely Australian. It was the product of circumstances and character combined. These new defenders would face the same challenges, and in facing them would discover their own capacity for heroism. The departure ceremonies were deliberately low-key, partly for security reasons, but also because the emotions involved were too deep for public display. Australian soldiers who had shared everything for months found themselves struggling with goodbyes that felt inadequate to mark such bonds. Handshakes lingered longer than usual. Addresses were exchanged with promises to write that both parties knew would be difficult to keep. Personal items changed hands. A lucky charm here, a photograph there. Small tokens that carried enormous meaning. "Keep the bastards honest" became a common farewell, delivered with grins that didn't quite hide the deeper emotions beneath. The Polish and British soldiers understood they were inheriting more than defensive positions. They were becoming custodians of a legend, guardians of a reputation that had been purchased with blood and sustained through months of hardship. As Australian units made their way to the harbour for evacuation, many found themselves taking final looks at the landscape that had shaped them so profoundly. The rocky escarpments where they had first faced German assault, the underground chambers where they had sheltered from countless bombardments, the simple crosses that marked where comrades had fallen. This desert fortress had been their world for 8 months, a world bounded by minefields and marked by the constant presence of danger. Yet it had also been the place where they had discovered strengths they hadn't known they possessed, where ordinary men had accomplished extraordinary things. The ships that carried them away were the same vessels that had sustained them through the siege. But now these familiar destroyers and cruisers bore them toward an uncertain future. The war was far from over. New battles awaited in different theaters, but nothing would ever quite match the intensity of those months in Tobruk. Behind them, the new garrison settled into positions still warm from their predecessors' presence. Polish soldiers peered through periscopes that Australian eyes had used to watch German movements. British troops checked weapons that had been maintained with the meticulous care born of absolute necessity. Yet even as the composition of the garrison changed, the essential character of the defence remained constant. Tobruk would continue to hold, continue to tie down German and Italian forces that Rommel desperately needed for other operations, continue to serve as a symbol of Allied determination in the face of overwhelming odds, and in the growing confidence of the new defenders, in their quick adaptation to siege conditions and their evident determination to maintain the standards set by their predecessors, lay the seeds of something larger. For far to the east, beyond the German siege lines, General Auchinleck was gathering forces for an operation that would finally break the deadlock in North Africa. Operation Crusader was taking shape, a massive offensive designed not merely to relieve Tobruk, but to drive Rommel's forces back across the hundreds of miles they had conquered. The siege that had lasted 8 months was about to enter its final phase, though none could know what trials and triumphs lay ahead. The lifting of the siege, a desert dawn. And so the great wheel of desert warfare began its final turn, as November 1941 brought with it the crisp promise of deliverance that the defenders of Tobruk had awaited through 8 months of siege. General Auchinleck's preparations had been meticulous, gathering the 8th Army's strength like storm clouds building on the horizon. 3 corps, over 100,000 men, hundreds of tanks rolling through the desert darkness toward their assembly areas. The defenders within Tobruk's perimeter could sense something stirring in the vast emptiness beyond their wire, though the details remained shrouded in the careful secrecy that such operations demanded. On November 18th, Operation Crusader began with the thunder of artillery that seemed to shake the very foundations of the desert, a rolling barrage that announced to every man within Tobruk's walls that their long vigil was entering its final phase. The sound carried differently than the sporadic shelling they had endured for so many months. This was the coordinated voice of an army on the move, purposeful and determined. The Polish and British troops, who now manned the defensive positions, felt the electricity of anticipation crackling through their ranks. Yet they maintained the disciplined patience that 8 months of siege warfare had taught their predecessors. They had inherited not just trenches and strongpoints, but the accumulated wisdom of men who had learned to read the desert's moods, to distinguish between the routine harassment of a siege and the building crescendo of decisive action. For 3 days, the sounds of battle raged beyond the German lines, sometimes distant, sometimes drawing closer, always carrying with it the promise that relief was finally at hand. The defenders could track the progress of the fighting by the changing patterns of aircraft overhead, by the shifting directions of artillery fire, by the subtle alterations in their captors' behavior as the siege lines began to waver under pressure from 2 directions. And then, on November 21st, came the moment that would live forever in the memory of every man who witnessed it. A small patrol of New Zealand infantry, dusty and exhausted from days of fighting, appeared at the eastern perimeter wire, their voices carrying across the defensive positions with words that seemed almost too precious to believe. "We're through. The siege is broken." The meeting between the relieving forces and Tobruk's defenders was marked not by wild celebration, but by the quiet satisfaction of soldiers who understood the magnitude of what had been accomplished. Handshakes and embraces, shared cigarettes and whispered conversations, the simple human recognition that passes between men who have faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious. Yet even as relief flooded through the garrison, the battle for North Africa was far from over. Rommel, ever the master tactician, was already orchestrating a fighting withdrawal, trading space for time as he sought to preserve his forces for future operations. The German and Italian troops, who had maintained the siege lines for 8 months, began their own orderly retreat, leaving behind the positions they had held with such determination. The defenders watched from their ramparts as the enemy forces melted away into the desert. Vehicles and artillery pieces silhouetted against the horizon as they moved westward, following the same routes that had brought them to Tobruk's gates in April. There was something almost dreamlike about witnessing the end of a siege that had defined every aspect of their existence for so many months, as if the sudden absence of constant threat left a strange emptiness in its wake. But it was in the days that followed, as the full scope of their achievement became clear, that the true magnitude of Tobruk's defense revealed itself. They had not merely survived 8 months of siege, they had fundamentally altered the course of the North African campaign. By holding this vital port, by denying Rommel the logistical base he desperately needed, they had prevented the Africa Corps from consolidating its early victories and pushing deeper into Egypt. The strategic implications rippled far beyond the desert, affecting the entire Mediterranean theater, influencing decisions in Berlin and London, demonstrating to the world that the German war machine was not invincible. Hitler's grand design for North Africa had foundered on the rocks of Tobruk's resistance, and the myth of Axis invincibility had suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. As December brought cooler temperatures to the desert, the men who had endured the siege began to process the full weight of their experience. They had entered Tobruk as soldiers, but they emerged as something more, tempered by hardship, bonded by shared sacrifice, carriers of a legacy that would endure long after the last shot was fired in North Africa. The Australian troops who had borne the brunt of the siege were already being celebrated across the Allied world. Their nickname, Rats of Tobruk, transformed from German mockery into a badge of honor that would be worn with pride for generations to come. But they themselves understood that their achievement belonged not to any single nation, but to the entire community of defenders who had stood together against seemingly impossible odds. In the quiet hours after the siege was lifted, many of the veterans found themselves walking the perimeter they had defended so fiercely, tracing the paths between strongpoints that had become as familiar as the streets of their hometowns. The defensive positions that had seemed so crucial, so vital to their survival, now appeared almost modest in the clear light of victory. Simple excavations in the sand that had somehow held back an entire army corps. the underground networks they had carved from the rocky ground, the supply dumps and command posts, the medical stations and communication centers, all bore witness to the remarkable ingenuity of men pushed to their limits. These installations would remain long after the war moved on, silent monuments to the determination of ordinary soldiers who had accomplished something extraordinary. And as the sun set on December 10th, marking exactly 8 months since the siege had begun, there was a sense of completion that went beyond mere military victory. The defenders had proven something fundamental about human resilience, about the power of collective will, about the ability of free men to stand firm in the face of tyranny. The desert itself seemed to acknowledge their achievement. The harsh landscape that had been both enemy and ally throughout the siege now appeared almost benevolent in the golden light of freedom. The same winds that had carried sand and shell fragments now brought the scents of cooking fires and the sounds of laughter, the simple pleasures of men who no longer needed to fear the dawn. In the months and years that followed, as the war moved on to other theaters, the siege of Tobruk would take its place among the great defensive actions in military history. Historians would analyze the tactical decisions, the logistical challenges, the strategic implications. But for those who lived through it, the true meaning of Tobruk lay in something more personal, more profound. They had discovered reserves of strength they never knew they possessed, had forged friendships that would last a lifetime, had participated in something larger than themselves. The siege had stripped away everything non-essential, revealing the bedrock qualities that define human character under extreme stress. And in that crucible, they had found not just survival, but a kind of triumph that transcended the mere mechanics of warfare. As the final supply ships departed Tobruk's harbor, no longer forced to run the gauntlet of enemy fire, their holds filled with men rotating home rather than desperately needed ammunition, there was a sense of the wheel coming full circle. The port that had been a symbol of isolation and defiance was once again what it had always been meant to be, a gateway between the desert and the sea, a point of connection rather than a fortress under siege. And in the growing darkness of that December evening, as the last light faded from the western horizon, the defenders of Tobruk could finally rest with the knowledge that their vigil was complete, that they had held their ground when holding seemed impossible, that they had written a chapter in the long story of human courage that would inspire generations yet unborn, while far above them the same stars that had witnessed their darkest hours now looked down upon their moment of quiet triumph. And the desert wind carried across the empty spaces the whispered promise that some victories, earned through sacrifice and sealed with brotherhood, echo through time itself like the eternal rhythm of waves against an ancient shore, bringing with them the certainty that courage, once proven in the crucible of desperate hours, becomes something imperishable, something that lives on in the very sand and stone of the places where ordinary men chose to stand firm against the darkness, and in standing, discovered they were ordinary no longer.